Today's video is about the neuroscience of climate action design. What does that mean? We have a brain, and the brain works in different ways. And what I've been learning about is that we have an intellectual brain that learns facts and figures and does exams and does mathematics. And then we have an action brain, which is the limbic system that controls our emotions and our behaviors and our goals. And you can kind of think of these things as two different brains. Welcome back to the channel where we talk about the psychology of driving environmental behavior and action. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to the channel, click the bell, and get a copy of my book, How to Save the World, and sign up to my website at katiepatrick.com where you can get more free resources and downloads about the behavioral psychology of making environmental change happen. Now, let's jump into this topic of how the brain works a bit more. A few days ago, I was putting together this slideshow trying to explain this concept of climate action design. And what I've realized goes on in our industry is that we've kind of been having these three phases of the way that we communicate and disclose climate data. The first iteration we could call carbon disclosure or climate data disclosure, where we're just looking at the data and basically thinking of it in terms of a spreadsheet of carbon emissions and trying to get that data out there. That was the first phase. Then the second phase you might think of as climate reporting or sustainability reporting. So we thought, let's give all this data over to a graphic designer and they'll make it look nice in a PDF and put it into some charts and we'll produce it once a year and show it to people, right? That's kind of where things are now. And so what I'm advocating for and trying to specialize in is this third iteration called climate action design. So we've got the data, we've got graphic design skills, but then we have this third layer where we're looking at the behavioral psychology or the human psychology and the neuroscience of how we look at that data and optimizing it so when people look at it, they actually take action. And in order to manifest that in people, that desire for action, we have to understand the neuroscience of the brain, of how humans come up with goals, decide to achieve those goals, and the brain chemicals like dopamine that drive us towards that goal. If we want to solve climate change, if we want to reach our climate goals and actually make the change happen that we want to see, we have to understand the human motivational system, which is the dopamine reward circuit. That is the part of the brain that drives us to achieve goals and gets that itch, that instinct for action. And so if you think about the human brain as having three types of layers, the outer layer is called the neocortex. That's the more, evolutionary speaking, the modern part of the brain. That's where all of our higher thought function, executive functioning, our IQ, that sort of thing, language, etc. comes from. That's where we learn things. That's the sort of the educational layer of the brain. Then when we go a little bit deeper in the brain, then we have the limbic system. This is where that dopamine reward system mostly happens, not exclusively, but mostly happens in that emotional deeper center. And then we have what you could call the reptilian brain. That's the deep kind of like survival sort of core inner part of the brain. When you think about it in an evolutionary context, this survival part of the brain is going to be much stronger in triggering people to act than our later evolutionary intellectual side of the brain. And so this takes us into this theory of the value action gap. A lot of us think that if we want to solve climate change, we need to educate people and we need to get people to care. But when we're taking this intellectual learning, more cerebral intellectual approach, we're really just working in this more modern outer cortex part of the brain. What we want to do with climate action design is we want to go into the deeper parts of the brain and we want to trigger that dopamine system where we see a goal and the dopamine drives us towards that goal. And when you're looking at the basic framework of how game design works, you have the person that you want to target, and then they all have a basic kind of like progress bar moving across the game. Games for toddlers have this, every single game, and every good UI design will also have this. And then there are particular bumps or circles that you go through, and then there's a final goal, and there'll be some kind of like animation or reward or point system at that final goal. And there can be colors and different rewards and different incentives as you go along that. And that's the basic mechanism of how this reward system works. Firstly, we need to have a goal. And when we're doing climate education, just learning about climate change and just learning about sustainability, that doesn't include a goal in it. That's just an educational experience. So you need to clearly identify this goal, both visually in the design and also descriptively with words, and just tell people, this is what we're here for, this is our goal. Also a conference, a festival, some kind of networking, that's not a goal either. Explicit measurement-driven goals and then tracking the progress towards that goal. Dopamine is the chemical that drives human behavior. It drives that itch for us to achieve a goal, and the dopamine system releases a reward feeling, a feeling of feeling good when we achieve that goal. And when something goes wrong with the goal, then we feel bad. I mean, you could even argue that all of human happiness and human psychology is whether your experience is above your expectation or below your expectation of that particular goal, right? This is core of how human neuroscience works. And what's so interesting about the dopamine reward system is that it triggers this very small part of the brain, very evolutionary speaking, ancient or old part of the brain, which is called the ventral tegmental area. This is the part of the brain that craves that romantic intimacy with someone that you're in love with. It's also the same part of the brain that's involved in addiction. It's the part of the brain that gets triggered when you take a line of cocaine. And it releases huge amounts of dopamine and will drive the human towards whatever goal that they want to achieve. And what we really need to do is be designing for dopamine. When a human looks at a goal that they want to achieve, and possibly that goal has been triggered because you've compared somebody to somebody else. Hey, look, you're doing 20% worse than everybody else. You're like, oh my God, I don't want to be 20% worse than everyone else. It releases a whole bunch of chemicals. It releases dopamine, it releases adrenaline, it releases cortisol. These chemicals aren't necessarily bad if they're just used for specific purposes. These are the chemicals that get activated when we intensely crave to want to complete a goal. And these type of behavioral science triggers, like just giving people a goal, tracking progress, comparing them to each other. It could be fear or risk in moderation. It could be because everyone else around you is doing it. But we have to ask the question, are we triggering the dopamine reward system? Are we triggering people's action centers of the brain that will drive them to intensely crave to want to complete that goal? And then are we designing systems to give people a reward experience? And in game design, when people complete the reward, in a simple UI design, you'll just get an animated checkbox. Oh, cool, I made it to the end of the progress bar. Let's just do a checkbox. That's the simple version. In really fancy game design, there'll be confetti, there'll be like dancing creatures, there'll be some incredible kind of like animation, something amazing will happen to the character. But it's basically the same type of thing, which is giving you a type of animated, novelty, excited sort of reward for completing the goal. This is the core thing to understand when we're looking at climate action design, and why it is a completely different craft to education design. Teaching people about environmental science and climate change is not designing for the dopamine reward system that is very specifically about goals and actions, tracking progress towards completing that goal and triggering that reward mechanism, and then making sure your design does that. I found starting to understand how the brain works and separating it between the intellectual learning brain and the emotional goal-seeking action brain to be enormously helpful when I'm looking at how to design for environmental behavior and action. And all of us who are in this space need to have this lens now that when we're looking at a design or a concept or a program or a government policy, we need to be looking at it through the lens of, is it triggering the action centers of the brain, or is it going to be just another failed program or idea or startup or conference or book that is just only triggering the intellectual part of the brain? And I would love us to all get really good at this type of climate action design, which is essentially designing for dopamine. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this interesting. I've really enjoyed learning about the neuroscience of action design. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Leave any comments about anything interesting that you're working on. Don't forget to subscribe to my website, katiepatrick.com. There's also the How to Save the World podcast and the How to Save the World book. And I hope you'll fall in love with the psychology of environmental behavior and action as much as I have.